Welcome to episode 12 of my Road to Rapid Top 1000 series. Now, if the background looks different and I look a little bit more tanner than I usually do, it's because I'm on vacation this week at the Jersey Shore. But the grind doesn't stop and I've been continuing to play and make some videos for you guys. And in this video, I'm going to feature a pretty interesting game that I played last week on my ascension into the 1900s against a pretty strong opponent, actually, even though his rapid rating is relatively low. I look at his profile, and he's actually a candidate master in real life, around 2100. So this is a pretty tough challenge for me. And he opened with d4, and I went for knight of 6. And c4, I played g6. He played knight of 3. And I went for bishop g7, already turning this into kind of a King's Indian setup. And so he played g3, looking to fianchetto his own bishop. And I castled. We have bishop g2. d6, just to open up the light square bishop. He castles, and I went for knight to d7. And after knight c3, I now went for e5, which this is called the Debrecen variation of the King's Indian, which doesn't mean a whole lot to me. I was just looking to expand in the center and attack his d4 pawn. And rather than take, which would kind of help me because it kind of opens up some space for my pieces, he instead played queen to c2. I played c6, just slowly expanding. And here he played rook to d1. And at this point, I already have to be quite careful because the rook is now lined up against my queen. And if I make some nonsensical move like a5, he can actually take here. And after pawn takes, he's able to win a pawn due to this pin against my knight, which is in the way of the queen. And so I played queen to c7, just getting the queen off of the d-file. And he now played b3, looking to just solidify his pawns and open the possibility of his bishop developing this way. So I continued developing by playing rook to e8, and he now took the pawn. And I decided rather than to take with my pawn, I took with the knight, opening up some space for the bishop to come out. And he now took, and I took, and now he played bishop to g5, developing his last minor piece and putting pressure against the knight. So now I was faced with sort of a tough decision on how to continue and where to develop my light square bishop. And I decided to develop it to f5, attacking his queen, but he now blocks the e-pawn, which I knew was coming. And I now played bishop to g4, attacking his rook, but again, he blocked with f3, and now I return to e6. So you might be asking yourself, what was the point of this whole maneuver? Why didn't I just put the bishop on e6 right away if I knew it was going to get harassed? I mean, how does this position with the bishop on e6 differ from the position that happened in the game? Well, what happens here is this bishop is actually quite powerful on this diagonal, and it's putting some pressure against the light squares. And so by making the maneuvers that I did and forcing these pawns forward, what happens is now this pawn on f3 and e4 are now kind of in the way of the bishop, and it no longer has the scope that it had a few moves ago. And to add to that, this diagonal is now open on which I could use to attack the king. So he now continues by trying to exploit some dark squares on my queen side and plays knight to e4, looking to jump into c5 and harass this bishop, and I can't allow his knight to infiltrate. So I brought my own knight back, defending this c5 square, and here he decided to double by playing rook to d2. He's looking to swing his other rook onto d1, and again, exert some pressure against my knight here. And so I responded by playing rook to c8, and he played rook to d1. And now I made a pretty crucial move in this position. I'm already a little bit cramped. My pieces don't have a lot of room to come forward, but what I could do is attack his poorly placed knight here by playing b5. And I had to kind of think a little bit about this move first to make sure that it works. But this is actually very annoying for white to deal with, because if he were to take, then I open an attack against his queen, logical for him to take. And after he brings the knight back to b2, which is the only square that it can go to, I can now double my rooks myself. And this is a pretty equal position with chances for both sides, which is something that he doesn't want to go into because he's fighting for an advantage. And if he doesn't trade, he has to figure out where to move the knight. If he moves the knight back to c3, I can just play queen to b6 check, and then maybe take this pawn at some point, infiltrate with the knight. He doesn't want to allow this. He plays knight to b2. And so the knight is now defending this pawn, but like I said, this diagonal is open, and so I played queen to b6 check. And here again, my opponent had to spend some time because this is a little bit of a tricky situation. The most logical move here would be to just move the king out of the way. But this is actually a trap. And now the move I have here is h6, attacking this bishop. And what you might notice is it can't retreat to f4 because of the pawn, and it can't retreat to e3 because of my queen, meaning its only square is h4. But after g5, this bishop is now trapped, and it's getting lost in the next move. So anticipating this, he played rook to f2, freeing some space for the bishop to retreat. And now we reach kind of the most critical position of the game. We're in sort of an advanced middle game stage, and you can see there's a lot going on, a lot of pieces protecting certain squares and attacking each other. And at this point I was debating between 3 different moves. And believe it or not, I actually chose the worst one, which I only realized after I went back that it was kind of not so good. But it's really not easy to see why. And before I show you what I did do, the moves that I should have made, and I think the simplest move to understand here is just the move h6, which attacks the dark square bishop, and obviously, again, it can't go to h4, it gets trapped, and other than that, it really has to just go back to c1, and now it no longer defends the d8 square, and I can simply bring a rook here, and maybe even bring my bishop here, and try to line up against the king. But instead, what I did was, I played the move f5, and the idea was I wanted to try to open the position while his rook is kind of vulnerable and he's in this pin. But the problem here is he would have had a way to punish this by playing the move bishop h3, which is not an easy move to find, and kind of unsurprisingly he didn't find it in the game. The idea is this bishop now puts a third attacker against the pawn on f5, and I can't take because the bishop will take with check, and after rook takes the knight, and I'm simply down a piece. And other than that, what can I possibly do here? I have to defend this pawn on f5, but if I play rook to f8, he can just come in with the rook and attack this bishop, and it's a very uncomfortable situation for me to be in. But luckily, he didn't see this, and he played king to h1, just logically getting his rook out of the pin, and I now played rook to f8. Like I said, I want to transition onto the king side where I'm trying to create some threats. And he played rook to d2, already threatening to take my knight and give up a rook for 2 minor pieces. So I played knight to f6. And my idea here was that I want to take this pawn and throw the knight into g4 and then create some threats on the f2 square. Like, for example, if he makes a slow move, let's just give him some random move like a4, and pawn takes, knight to g4 now threatens a fork between the rook and the king. But of course, this is very wishful thinking. He's going to strike fast, and he plays rook to d6, now meaning I have to deal with the threat against the bishop. So I played rook to e8, and here he realized that I want to create some threats with the knight in the future, so he decided to take this opportunity to simply get rid of my knight, which is kind of why I should have played h6 a few moves ago. He wouldn't even have the opportunity to get rid of my knight. But now I have to deal with the consequences, and I take with the rook. And now here he took on b5, and this is a little bit of a problem for me because this pawn is now under a lot of attacks, and I can't take back because obviously I lose my queen. So what I have to do is take with the queen, but first I decided to take on e4, just seeing if maybe I could trick him. Like, for example, if he gets concentrated on this pawn and takes it, I can then take here and attack the bishop. But of course, after me taking on e4, he just took with the queen, and now I took on b5. And at this point, both of us were getting relatively low on the clock. This is only a 15-minute game after all, and even with 10 seconds increment, it doesn't make up for all the time you spend thinking on every move. And here he saw an opportunity to win a pawn and transition into an endgame that he felt like he would be able to win. And so he played queen takes c6, and after queen takes c6, he took with the rook. But this doesn't quite work the way he expected it to, because in this position, I have a little bit of a hidden tactic here. And here I played the move, bishop takes b3. And it's now a discovered attack against this rook, and I'm also attacking this rook. So it's basically forcing him to decide which rook he wants to save. And if he takes this bishop, I will take this rook, and now I'm up at the exchange. So that leaves him no choice. He has to take the rook on f6. But after me taking his rook, this rook is still under attack, and he has to move it. And in this situation, he actually made sort of a critical error. So what he thought was, I'm going to get this rook out of danger, move it over here to a6, pick up this pawn on a7, and I'm going to be a pawn up and I'll be able to fight for a win in this endgame. And so he played rook to a6. But after bishop to e2, and he takes on a7, what you might realize is there's a very critical vulnerability in his position, which I was able to exploit in just one move. See if you can find the weakness and the way to exploit it. So the weakness in my opponent's position is this knight on b2, which is very awkwardly placed, and by extension, his back rank is also weak. So here I play the move, rook to b8, and believe it or not, white is pretty much losing already. Because there's no way for him to defend the knight on b2, the rook is simply misplaced, and if he moves the knight, I'm able to come in with rook to b1 check, and now his only way to protect his king is to play bishop f1, after which I can just take, and I'm up a whole piece. So in this position, he just gave up on his knight and played bishop h3, looking to at least create some attacks against my king. But I simply took on f3 with check, and after king moved to g1, I picked up the knight, and now I've recovered the pawn, and I'm up a piece. And here he played bishop to e6 check, and I played king to h8, and it would be amazing if he could create a back rank third of his own and attack the king, but luckily for me, my bishop on f3 covers a8, so he played rook to d7, looking to check on d8, and forced me to give up my bishop. But, of course, I'm one move in time, and what I could have done is be very cautious and play the move rook to b8, but a lot of times the best defense is good offense. So I played the move bishop to h6, now looking to attack him by playing bishop to e3 and rook to b1, checkmate. So here he's pretty much lost. He can't even really retreat his rook because my bishop guards even the d1 square. So he simply tried one last maneuver with his rook to d8 check. But after king to g7, rook to g8 check, my king escapes to f6. And now he tried one last trick. I'm not sure if this was a blunder or maybe he was hoping that I wouldn't notice that I could take his rook. But he played the move rook to f8, looking to pick up the bishop. But of course, the f8 square is guarded by my bishop. So I simply took the rook. And in this position, my opponent resigned. And I was able to win a very nice game against actually a pretty strong opponent. And this game actually very much reminded me of the game that I featured in my second ever Road to Rapid episode, where I beat a national master in the Grunfeld, and it was a very similar tight battle with a lot of back and forth, after which my opponent eventually made a blunder, and I was able to win the game. And in this case, again, my opponent kind of rushed in to try to pick up a pawn, and left his piece vulnerable, and I was able to win it and win the game. So I was able to get the win, and this was actually my 5th win out of 9 consecutive wins in a row. The win that started the streak was the game that I featured in last week's episode, and this is the 5th out of 9, meaning that I've actually been able to reach 1941 in Rapid, the highest rating that I've had yet, which puts me into the top 3,000 Rapid players on chess.com, which is a pretty nice milestone, but still not even close to where I want to end up, and I'm just going to keep grinding until I get to the top 1,000. Stay tuned for more.